2 hours after I gave birth to our daughter, the nurse placed her in my husband's arms, and he handed her back to me almost immediately, stepping away from the bed like I'd handed him something that burned.
"I need some air,"
he said, not looking at either of us, and walked out of the delivery room while I was still hooked up to an IV, still bleeding, still holding our 6-pound daughter against my chest, with hands that were shaking from more than exhaustion. My mother, who'd been waiting in the hallway, came in to find me crying, asking her over and over what had just happened, because I genuinely didn't know. He came back 40 minutes later, sat in the chair by the window instead of near the bed, and barely spoke for the rest of that day. When the nurse asked if he wanted to hold the baby again before visiting hours ended, he said quietly that he wasn't ready. I remember looking at him across that hospital room, this man I'd married 4 years earlier, wondering what could possibly have happened in the span of a single afternoon to make him look at his own daughter like she was a stranger. I had no idea that night, holding her alone while the machines beeped softly around us, that someone had spent the entire day making sure exactly this would happen. My name is Ashley. I'm 30, and until that day, I would have told you my marriage was, if not perfect, genuinely happy. I met my husband, Tyler, 6 years ago through mutual friends in Denver, and we married 2 years later in a small ceremony neither of us has ever regretted. He works in commercial real estate, steady hours, steady temperament, the kind of person friends describe as even-keeled, which had always felt like one of the things I loved most about him. He wasn't a man given to dramatic reactions. That's part of why what happened in that delivery room felt so impossible to reconcile with the person I thought I knew. Our pregnancy hadn't been entirely without its own quiet tensions. Tyler's sister, Brianna, had never been particularly warm toward me, in a way I'd chalked up for years to ordinary sibling protectiveness, the kind some sisters have toward a brother's wife, especially early in a marriage. She'd made a handful of comments over the years, always just barely deniable, about how quickly Tyler and I had moved toward marriage, how she hoped I really knew him, phrases that always left me slightly unsettled without ever quite rising to something worth confronting directly. Tyler, for his part, had always brushed off my occasional mentions of it as me reading too much into ordinary sibling dynamics. And for a long time, I believed him. I told myself, for years, that this was just Brianna being Brianna, and that it would soften with time, the way these things sometimes do once a baby arrives and families settle into new roles. I'm not writing this as someone without my own imperfections. I can be conflict avoidant in ways that let small tensions linger longer than they should. I'd noticed things about Brianna's behavior for years and mostly chosen not to address them directly, hoping the discomfort would simply fade on its own. That instinct, as it turned out, left a door open that someone else was more than willing to walk through. The days following the birth didn't get easier. They got quietly, steadily worse. Tyler came home from the hospital with us 3 days later, but the distance he'd shown in that delivery room hadn't lifted. He'd hold our daughter, Nora, only when I asked him to directly, always briefly, always with a strange, careful stiffness in how he positioned his arms, like he was handling something he wasn't sure belonged to him. He stopped using her name in casual conversation, referring to her instead as the baby, a small linguistic shift I noticed almost immediately and couldn't stop noticing once I had. Then it was the questions he started asking, always indirect, always framed as idle curiosity. He asked one night while I was nursing whether I remembered exactly which week Nora had been conceived, phrased casually enough that I answered without thinking much of it, though something about the specificity of the question stayed with me afterward. He asked another time whether I'd kept in touch with a friend from my old job, a man named Colin I hadn't spoken to in over a year, in a tone that tried very hard to sound uninterested and didn't quite manage it. Then it was Brianna's visits, which increased noticeably in that first month, always timed for moments when she and Tyler could talk privately in the kitchen while I fed Nora in the other room. I couldn't hear most of what they discussed, but I noticed the pattern of it. Hushed voices, conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked in, Brianna's hand on Tyler's shoulder in a way that felt less like sisterly comfort and more like someone steering a conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. Then it was the silence between Tyler and me directly. We stopped having the easy, half-finished conversations that used to fill our evenings. He started staying up later than me, scrolling through his phone in the living room instead of coming to bed, and I started lying awake upstairs, running through every possible thing I could have done to cause whatever this was, without ever landing on an answer that made sense. Then it was Tyler's parents, who I noticed growing noticeably quieter around me at the small family dinner we had 2 weeks after Nora was born. His mother, normally affectionate, kept the conversation carefully surface level, complimenting the nursery, asking about sleep schedules, never once asking to hold Nora the way grandmothers usually can't help themselves from doing. I didn't understand at the time that Brianna had likely already planted seeds with them, too, small enough that nobody would ever trace the discomfort back to a single conversation, large enough that the whole room had shifted without me fully registering why. None of these, on their own, felt like something I could confront directly without more information than I had. That was, I think, exactly the space someone else needed to keep working in. Nothing rising to the level of a direct question I could ask, until the distance between my husband and our daughter had grown wide enough that I could no longer tell myself it would simply pass. The moment in the delivery room wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first visible sign of something that had apparently already been set in motion before I'd even gone into labor. I didn't confront Tyler directly during that first month. I was too exhausted, too consumed with a newborn and a body still healing to summon the kind of clarity a confrontation like that would require. Instead, one night after he'd finally fallen asleep on the couch, phone still in his hand, I found myself looking at the screen, not out of habit, but out of a slow, uneasy need to understand what had been eating at him for weeks. His messages with Brianna were still open. What I found there took my breath away in a way I hadn't braced myself for. 2 days before I went into labor, Brianna had sent Tyler a series of screenshots, text messages, supposedly between me and Colin, dated from months earlier, filled with language that painted a picture I didn't recognize as my own life at all. Alongside them was a photo, blurry, taken from a distance, showing a woman who resembled me standing close to a man outside a restaurant I didn't recognize. Timestamped from a week I could account for entirely. A week I'd spent almost exclusively at physical therapy for pregnancy-related back pain. A schedule Tyler himself had driven me to twice. Brianna's accompanying message read, "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but I think you deserve to know before the baby comes. I'm so sorry." I sat on the bathroom floor after finding those messages, phone in hand, reading Brianna's words over and over, trying to reconcile the version of my life described in those screenshots with the one I'd actually been living. The messages attributed to me used phrasing I didn't recognize, references to conversations I had no memory of, the kind of details that read convincingly to someone who didn't know my actual voice,
but that felt subtly, unmistakably wrong to me the longer I looked at them. Tyler had received all of it 2 days before I went into labor, sat with it silently through what should have been one of the most joyful days of both our lives, and walked into that delivery room already carrying a version of events that made him unable to look at his own daughter without wondering, in some quiet, devastated part of himself, whether she was actually his. I didn't wake Tyler up that night. Something in me went very still instead of furious. The particular stillness that comes right before you realize screaming about something this fragile could destroy it permanently, whether the accusation turns out to be true or not. I photographed every message and image on his phone before setting it back exactly where I'd found it, hands shaking the entire time, careful to leave no trace that anything had been touched, moving with a quiet precision I didn't know I had until I needed it. Then I spent the following days doing something I never imagined myself doing, quietly investigating my own life, the way you'd investigate a stranger's, trying to find hard proof of where I'd actually been during the timestamp on that photo. My physical therapy office kept detailed appointment logs, and I called them the next morning, explaining as calmly as I could manage that I needed copies of my visit records for insurance purposes. The dates matched exactly what I remembered. 2 appointments that week, both confirmed by check-in timestamps that lined up precisely with the moment the photo claimed I'd been somewhere else entirely. I also looked more closely at the photo itself,
The blurry one of a woman who resembled me. Something about the framing bothered me the longer I studied it. The angle, the distance, the way the woman's hair was styled slightly differently than I'd worn mine in over a year. I sent it, without context, to my sister, who'd known me since childhood. She texted back within minutes. "That's not you. Your hair hasn't been that short since college." During those same weeks, I also started noticing how carefully I'd begun performing normalcy for everyone around me. Smiling through pediatrician visits, answering, "We're adjusting," whenever anyone asked how things were going, while privately keeping a folder of my own on a laptop Tyler never used, dated and organized the same methodical way I imagine a detective might build a case. Except the case was my own marriage, and the innocence I was trying to prove was mine. I also leaned harder into the parts of new motherhood that were entirely mine to hold on to, regardless of what was happening around me. The quiet 3 a.m. feedings where it was just Nora and me, her small hand curled around my finger, a bond nobody's lies could touch, even while everything else in the house felt unsteady. I didn't confront Brianna yet. I kept gathering. The appointment records, my sister's observation, a growing list of baits and receipts I could account for independently. I moved through those weeks caring for Nora with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation anymore, and everything to do with the strange, cold work of proving my own innocence to a husband who hadn't even asked me the question directly. My sister, once I told her what was actually happening, remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. She asked whether I knew what had happened to Tyler's college girlfriend, a woman named Rachel he'd dated seriously before we met, whose engagement to him had ended abruptly, right before what would have been their wedding. I'd always understood, from Tyler himself, that the relationship simply hadn't worked out. My sister, who'd stayed loosely in touch with someone from that era of Tyler's life, told me a different version. That Rachel had left Tyler after Brianna presented her with strikingly similar evidence of infidelity involving a man Rachel barely knew. Evidence Rachel herself had described, years later, as never quite adding up.
though by the time she'd realized it, the engagement was already broken and the wedding already canceled. My sister told me what little she remembered secondhand, careful to note she hadn't spoken to Rachel directly in years and might not have every detail right. But the shape of it was clear enough. A fabricated infidelity, evidence that looked convincing enough in the moment to end an engagement, and a family that closed ranks around Brianna's version of events before Rachel had any real chance to defend herself. By the time Rachel realized how thin the proof actually was, the wedding had already been canceled, and most of their mutual friendships had already reorganized themselves around the breakup. I sat with that information for a long time. It reframed everything happening in my own marriage in a way the doctored photo alone hadn't. This wasn't Brianna reacting, however misguidedly, to a genuine suspicion about me. This was a pattern. A woman who had done this once before, successfully enough to end an entire engagement, and who had simply refined the same approach, timed even more precisely, to use against me at the most vulnerable moment imaginable. I didn't know, and still don't fully know, exactly what drove her to do this twice. What I did know was that this wasn't about protecting her brother from a bad marriage. It was about something in Brianna that needed to be the most important woman in Tyler's life, at any cost to the women who threatened that position. I didn't confront Brianna directly. I went to Tyler first, alone, on a night I'd asked my mother to watch Nora so we could talk without interruption. I laid it out for him carefully, one piece at a time. The physical therapy appointment logs, time-stamped and official. My sister's observation about the hair in the photo. And finally, gently, because I knew this part would hurt him more than anything else, what Rachel had apparently gone through years earlier, using nearly identical tactics. Tyler read through everything in silence, his face moving through something I can only describe as a kind of collapse. Not anger at me, but a dawning, horrified understanding of what he'd allowed himself to believe, and what it had cost him with our daughter for the first weeks of her life. He kept apologizing before I'd even finished laying out the last piece of evidence, as though the weight of what he'd almost destroyed had already made itself clear to him before I needed to spell it out further. He called Brianna that same night, put her on speaker with my permission, and asked her directly, calmly,
where the photo had actually come from. She tried, at first, to insist it was real, that a mutual friend had sent it to her, a friend she then couldn't name when pressed. When Tyler mentioned Rachel by name, there was a long silence on the line before Brianna's voice changed entirely, defensive in a way that told both of us everything her words weren't quite saying yet. I didn't need to raise my voice through any of it. The facts did what facts do when someone's already lying under pressure. They made her story fall apart faster with every question Tyler asked. Tyler apologized to me more times over the following weeks than I could count, and more importantly, he apologized to Nora in his own way, spending hours simply holding her, relearning day by day the bond that had been stolen from both of them in those first difficult weeks. It wasn't instant. Trust rarely rebuilds on a single honest conversation, no matter how thorough. We went to counseling together, working through not just what Brianna had done, but why Tyler had been willing to believe it so completely without simply asking me first. Brianna and Tyler haven't spoken in the months since, beyond a single conversation where he told her, plainly, that what she'd done had cost him weeks he'd never get back with his own daughter, and that he needed distance from her for a long time, possibly permanently. I don't know if that will change eventually. I've made my peace with not knowing. Rachel reached out to me once, through a mutual acquaintance, after word of what happened reached her second-hand. We talked for almost 2 hours on the phone. 2 women who'd been hurt by the same person in different decades of her life, comparing notes on things that finally made sense to both of us for the first time. Tyler's parents, once they understood what had actually happened, were mortified at how easily they'd let the distance settle in without asking either of us directly what was wrong. His mother came by the following week with a small gift for Nora and stayed for hours, holding her the way I'd expected from the very beginning, apologizing more than once for not trusting her own instincts sooner. Not everything closed as neatly as I might have wanted. Nora is older now, walking, saying her first words, and Tyler is a devoted father in every way that matters, though I sometimes catch him looking at her with an expression I recognize as quiet grief for the weeks he lost at the very beginning. I don't think that feeling fully goes away. I think you learn to carry it differently instead. What I gained wasn't just proof of my own innocence, though I won't pretend that mattered less than everything else. What I gained was a marriage that survived being tested in the worst possible way, and the hard, ongoing lesson that love without direct communication is not actually as safe as it feels. I think about how close we came to losing everything because one person chose to whisper instead of ask, and because my husband chose to believe a photograph over 4 years of knowing me. None of it looked like sabotage while it was happening. It looked like a worried sister trying to protect her brother. And that was exactly what made it so effective. So I'll leave you with a question that stayed with me since that hospital room. How much damage can a single, unverified accusation do to the people who trust each other most? And if someone you loved suddenly pulled away from you without explanation, would you ask them directly? Or would you let the silence do the deciding for you?